The gold band caught the afternoon sun like a promise being broken, and Grace Holloway couldn't bear to look at it anymore as she stood behind the counter of the Mercantile in Rhyolite, Nevada, where she'd worked for the past 3 weeks since burying her husband. The summer heat of 1906 pressed against the wooden walls of the shop, making the air thick and heavy with dust and the scent of dried goods. Grace had placed the ring on a small velvet cushion she'd found in the back room, setting it near the register where anyone who came in might see it. The gold was worn smooth from 2 years of marriage, and inside the band, Thomas had inscribed their initials with a date that now felt like it belonged to someone else's life entirely. She was 22 years old and had never imagined she would be selling the symbol of her marriage before her second anniversary. But the fever that swept through Rhyolite in early June had taken Thomas in less than a week. It had taken others too, mostly men who worked in the mines, and the town had barely had time to mourn one before burying another. The doctor said it came from the water or the rats or maybe just bad luck, and Grace supposed it didn't matter much which explanation was true because Thomas was still gone. The money from selling the ring would pay for her room at the boarding house for another month and maybe buy her passage on the stage coach to Carson City, where her sister lived with her husband and 3 children. Grace didn't want to impose on them, but she didn't see what other choice she had. The wages from the Mercantile barely covered her food, and Mr. Peterson, the owner, had made it clear that he'd only hired her out of charity and could let her go anytime business slowed down. The bell above the door chimed, and Grace looked up to see a cowboy stepping inside, his hat in his hands before he'd even fully crossed the threshold. She'd seen him around town a few times over the past month, always polite, always keeping to himself. He was tall with sun-weathered skin and dark hair that curled slightly at his collar. His eyes were a striking blue-green, the color of the shallow parts of the Carson River, and they took in the shop with quiet observation. "Afternoon, madam," he said, his voice low and respectful. "Good afternoon," Grace replied, smoothing her black morning dress and hoping her eyes weren't as red as they felt. She'd been crying that morning, but she thought she'd managed to compose herself before opening the shop. The cowboy approached the counter slowly, and Grace noticed he moved with a slight limp, favoring his left leg. His clothes were clean but worn, the kind of practical durability that spoke of a working man who took care of what he had because he couldn't afford to replace it often. "I'm looking for some tobacco and rolling papers," he said. Then his gaze fell on the ring sitting on its velvet cushion. His expression shifted, something crossing his features that Grace couldn't quite read. "That for sale?" Grace swallowed hard. She'd put it out to sell it, but now that someone was actually asking, the words stuck in her throat. "Yes," she managed finally. "I'm asking $30 for it." It was more than the ring was probably worth, but it was worth that much to her, and she figured if someone was going to take it, they should pay a price that reflected the weight of what it meant. The cowboy didn't blink at the amount. He studied the ring for a long moment, and Grace found herself studying him in return. He had an honest face, she decided, with lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled more often than he frowned, even though he wasn't smiling now. There was something gentle about the way he looked at the ring, as if he understood it wasn't just a piece of jewelry. "May I?" he asked, gesturing toward it. Grace nodded, and he picked up the ring carefully, holding it up to the light streaming through the window. His hands were calloused and scarred, the hands of someone who knew hard work intimately, but his touch was delicate as he examined the gold band. "It's a good ring," he said quietly. "Well made. Your husband was a lucky man." The kindness in his words nearly undid her. Grace blinked rapidly, forcing back the tears that threatened to spill over. "He was a good man," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The cowboy set the ring back down gently. "I'm sorry for your loss, madam. Can see it's fresh." 3 weeks, Grace said, then wondered why she'd shared that information with a stranger. He nodded slowly, his eyes meeting hers with unexpected understanding. "Lost my brother 6 months back in a mine collapse in Colorado. I know it's not the same as losing a husband, but I know that particular kind of empty." Grace found herself wanting to thank him, not just for the condolences, which she'd heard plenty of since Thomas died, but for the way he said it. There was no attempt to tell her it would get better with time, or that Thomas was in a better place, or any of the other platitudes that people offered with good intentions, but left her feeling more alone than ever. "Are you new to Rhyolite?" she asked, reaching for something to say that would keep him standing there a moment longer. The shop had been empty all morning, and the silence had been pressing down on her like a physical weight. "Fairly new," he said. "Been here about 2 months. I'm working at the Montgomery Shoshone mine." "Name's Owen Dalton." "Grace Holloway," she replied, though she supposed he probably already knew that. Everyone in Rhyolite seemed to know everyone else's business. "Pleased to meet you properly, Mrs. Holloway," Owen said. He glanced back at the ring, and Grace saw something shift in his expression, as though he was working through a complicated problem in his head. "Would you hold that ring for me until tomorrow? I'd like to buy it, but I need to get to the bank before it closes to withdraw the money." Grace felt a sharp pang of loss mixed with relief. She needed the money desperately, but selling the ring felt like severing the last connection she had to Thomas, to the life they'd planned together. Still, sentiment didn't pay for room and board. "Of course," she said. "I'll put it aside for you." Owen reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn leather wallet. He counted out $3 and placed them on the counter. "A deposit, so you know I'm good for it." Grace started to protest that it wasn't necessary, but Owen held up a hand. "Please, madam, it's only right." She took the money and wrote him a receipt on a scrap of paper, her handwriting shaky. Owen folded the receipt carefully and tucked it into his shirt pocket. He bought his tobacco and rolling papers, paid for them, and tipped his hat to her before leaving. Grace watched him through the window as he limped down the dusty Main Street, disappearing into the general flow of miners, merchants, and townsfolk going about their business. That evening, Grace sat in her small room at the boarding house and thought about Owen Dalton. She wondered what he wanted with a woman's wedding ring, but it wasn't really her concern. Maybe he had someone back home he was planning to marry. Maybe he was buying it to sell somewhere else for a profit, though she doubted that given the price. Maybe he just thought it was a good ring and had his own reasons. She tried not to think about the fact that when she handed it over tomorrow, she would be truly and completely untethered from the life she'd built with Thomas. The ring was the last thing of value they'd owned together. Everything else had been sold or lost in the weeks after his death. Their little house had been rented, and the landlord had wasted no time finding new tenants. Their furniture had been meager, and most of it had belonged to the house anyway. Thomas's clothes she'd given to other miners who needed them. His tools had been sold to pay the undertaker. The ring was all she had left, and tomorrow it would belong to Owen Dalton, a man she didn't know and probably wouldn't see much of after the transaction was complete. Grace slept poorly that night, tossing in the narrow bed as memories of Thomas played through her mind. She remembered their wedding day in Carson City, how nervous he'd been when he slipped the ring on her finger, how his hands had shaken slightly. She remembered the way he'd kissed her afterward, gentle and sweet, as if she were something precious he was afraid of breaking. She remembered their arrival in Rhyolite 8 months ago, full of hope about the opportunities in the booming mining town, about the life they would build together. It had all ended so quickly. One day Thomas was healthy and laughing, teasing her about her cooking and stealing kisses when he thought no one was looking. A week later he was burning with fever, delirious and unreachable, and then he was gone. The speed of it still took her breath away when she let herself think about it too long. Morning came too quickly. Grace dressed in her black morning dress again, the same one she wore every day because it was the only one she owned anymore. She dyed 3 of her dresses black after Thomas died, using ink and coal dust mixed with water, but 2 of them had been too worn to save and had fallen apart in the process. This one had held up, though the fabric was starting to shine at the elbows and the hem was frayed. She walked to the mercantile in the cool morning air, before the sun had risen high enough to turn rhyolite into an oven. The town was already bustling with activity. Miners were heading to their shifts, women were shopping for their daily provisions, and children too young for school were playing in the alleys between buildings. Rhyolite had grown rapidly over the past few years, swelling from nothing to a town of thousands almost overnight when gold was discovered in the surrounding hills. It had all the energy and chaos of a place that had sprung up too fast, where fortunes could be made or lost in a day, and everyone was chasing something just out of reach. Grace unlocked the mercantile and began her usual morning routine of sweeping the floor and arranging the stock. Mr. Peterson came in an hour later, barely grunting a greeting before disappearing into the back office. He was a sour man who seemed to resent the very existence of his customers, and Grace often wondered how he stayed in business. She supposed it was because the mercantile had been one of the first shops in Rhyolite, and people were creatures of habit. She was helping an older woman find a particular type of thread when the bell chimed and Owen Dalton walked in. He looked like he'd cleaned up specially for the occasion, his face freshly shaved and his hair combed back. He was wearing what appeared to be his best shirt, though it was still just a simple cotton work shirt, and he'd polished his boots. Grace finished with the older woman and then turned to Owen, her heart beating faster than it should. She told herself it was just nervousness about parting with the ring, nothing more. "Good morning, Mrs. Holloway," Owen said, removing his hat. "Good morning, Mr. Dalton," Grace replied. "I have the ring set aside for you." She reached under the counter where she'd stored the velvet cushion overnight and placed it between them. The gold band gleamed in the morning light, and Grace had to resist the urge to pick it up one last time, to feel the weight of it in her palm, to remember what it had felt like to wear it. Owen reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. He counted out $27 in bills, adding it to the 3 he'd given her yesterday. Grace counted it carefully, though she trusted that it was all there. It was more money than she'd held in her hand since Thomas died, and it should have felt like salvation. Instead, it felt like defeat. She was writing out a receipt when Owen spoke. "Mrs. Holloway, before you give me the ring, I wonder if you might answer a question for me." Grace looked up, surprised. "Of course." Owen seemed to be choosing his words carefully. "Why are you selling it?" "I know that might seem like a foolish question given that you clearly need the money, but I've been thinking about it since yesterday, and I get the sense that this ring means more to you than just its value in gold." Grace felt her throat tighten. It was exactly the question she'd been asking herself since she'd first had the idea to sell it. "I need money to leave Rhyolite," she said quietly, glancing toward the back office to make sure Mr. Peterson wasn't listening. "My sister lives in Carson City, and I thought if I could get enough for passage on the stagecoach, I could start over there, find better work, stop being a burden on charity." Owen nodded slowly. "And where will you go after that, after Carson City?" The question caught Grace off guard because she hadn't thought that far ahead. She'd been so focused on just getting through each day, on finding some way to survive the crushing weight of her grief and loneliness, that she hadn't considered what came after. "I don't know," she admitted. "I suppose I'll see what opportunities present themselves." Owen picked up the ring, holding it in his palm and studying it again. "Can I tell you why I wanted to buy this ring?" Grace nodded, curious despite herself. "I wanted to buy it to give back to you," Owen said, and before Grace could process what that meant, he continued. "Mrs. Holloway, I know this is going to sound crazy, and I know you're going to think I've lost my mind, but I need to say it anyway. I've been watching you for weeks now, seeing the way you carry your grief with such dignity, the way you keep going even when it's clear that every day is a struggle. I've been thinking about what it means to lose someone you love, about what my brother would want for me if our positions were reversed, and I keep coming back to the same conclusion." He took a deep breath, and Grace realized with shock that his hands were trembling slightly. "I think life is too short and too uncertain to waste time on convention. I think when you see something worth holding on to, you have to reach for it even if it seems impossible. I think you deserve better than selling the symbol of your first marriage just to scrape by." Owen looked directly into her eyes, and Grace saw fierce determination there mixed with vulnerability. "Grace Holloway, I know we barely know each other. I know this is the second conversation we've ever had. I know you're in mourning and I have no right to ask this. But I'm going to ask anyway because I've learned that tomorrow isn't promised to any of us." He held up the ring between them. "Would you consider marrying me? Not now, not until you're ready, but someday. Would you consider building a new life with me? One where you don't have to sell precious things to survive. One where you have someone standing beside you instead of watching you struggle alone." Grace stared at him, unable to form words. The proposal was so unexpected, so completely impossible, that she couldn't quite believe it was happening. She waited for him to laugh and tell her it was a joke, but Owen just stood there, completely serious, holding her wedding ring like an offering. "I know I'm not much," Owen continued when she didn't respond. "I'm just a mine worker with a bad leg and barely enough money saved up to matter, but I work hard and I don't drink or gamble my wages away. I've got a small house on the edge of town, nothing fancy but it's mine, paid for. I could provide for you, give you stability, and maybe, given time, we could build something real together, something that honors what you had with your husband but also looks forward instead of back." Grace found her voice finally, though it came out shaky. "Mr. Dalton, you can't possibly mean this. You don't know me. I don't know you. People don't get married like this." "People in the West do," Owen said quietly. "Maybe not in the cities back east, but out here, I've seen plenty of marriages start with less than what we have. At least we've spoken to each other kindly. At least we have some sense of each other's character. And I'm not asking you to love me right away. I'm just asking you to consider the possibility that maybe we could be partners in this life, help each other through the hard times." He set the ring down on the counter and pushed the money back toward Grace. "Keep the money. Consider it a gift with no strings attached, and keep the ring. Think about what I'm offering. If the answer is no, I'll understand and I won't bother you again. But if there's any part of you that thinks maybe this could work, that maybe we could build something good together, then come find me. I live in the small white house past the Methodist church, the one with the vegetable garden out front." Before Grace could respond, Owen put his hat back on, tipped it to her, and walked out of the mercantile, leaving her standing there with $30 and her wedding ring, and a proposal that had turned her entire world upside down. Grace spent the rest of the day in a daze, mechanically helping customers while her mind spun in circles. She kept replaying Owen's words, trying to find the angle, the trick, The reason why a man she barely knew would propose marriage to a widow he'd spoken to exactly twice. It made no logical sense, and yet something in the way he'd said it, the sincerity in his eyes, made her believe he'd meant every word. That evening, Grace walked to the Methodist church and stood across the street from the small white house Owen had described. It was modest but well-maintained, with a neat vegetable garden growing in front. She could see tomato plants heavy with fruit and what looked like beans and squash. Someone was taking care of that garden with attention and dedication. She didn't approach the house. She just stood there until the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded her of the evening Thomas had proposed, back in Carson City, when they were both young and stupid and convinced that love was all you needed to build a life. Grace turned away and walked back to the boarding house, where she lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling and trying to make sense of her tangled emotions. Part of her wanted to dismiss Owen's proposal as the desperate words of a lonely man who didn't understand what he was asking. But another part of her, a part she was almost afraid to acknowledge, was drawn to the idea of having someone again, of not facing each day alone. She wasn't sure she could ever love anyone the way she'd loved Thomas. That kind of love felt like it only came once in a lifetime, if you were lucky enough to find it at all. But maybe Owen was right that marriage could be about partnership and companionship, about facing life's challenges together instead of alone. Maybe love could grow from that foundation, different than what she'd had before but no less real. The next morning, Grace opened the mercantile as usual, but her mind was made up. She waited until her lunch break, then told Mr. Peterson she needed to step out for personal business. He grumbled but waved her away, and Grace walked through the dusty streets of Rhyolite toward the White House, past the Methodist church. Her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. She didn't know what she was going to say, hadn't rehearsed any words. She only knew that Owen Dalton had offered her something precious, a lifeline when she was drowning, and she owed it to herself to at least explore the possibility. She knocked on the door, and after a moment, Owen answered. He was in his work clothes, covered in dust from the mine, and his face registered surprise when he saw her standing there. "Mrs. Holloway," he said, quickly trying to brush some of the dirt off his shirt. "I wasn't expecting you. Please come in." Grace stepped into the small house and was immediately struck by how clean and organized it was. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a small wooden table and 2 chairs near the stove, and a worn but comfortable-looking armchair by the fireplace. Everything was tidy and in its place, and there were little touches that suggested Owen had tried to make the space homey: a rag rug on the floor, curtains in the windows, a tin vase with wildflowers on the table. "I know it's not much," Owen said, following her gaze. "But it's sturdy and the roof doesn't leak." Grace turned to face him, and the words came out before she could second-guess them. "I need you to understand something, Mr. Dalton. I loved my husband very much. Part of me will always love him. I can't promise that I'll ever feel that way about you." Owen nodded slowly. "I understand. But," Grace continued, forcing herself to hold his gaze, "I also don't want to leave Rhyolite. I realized that when I was standing in the mercantile yesterday, counting your money. This is the last place I lived with Thomas. We chose this town together, planned our future here together. Leaving feels like abandoning him somehow." She took a breath, steadying herself. "You offered me partnership and companionship. You offered me a way forward that doesn't require me to give up the past. If that offer is still open, if you're truly serious about this, then my answer is yes. I'll marry you, Owen Dalton, and I'll do my best to be a good wife to you, even if I can't promise you'll have all of my heart." Owen's expression transformed, hope and relief washing over his features. "That's all I'm asking for, Grace. A chance. That's all." He crossed the room and took her hands in his, and Grace was struck again by the gentleness of his touch. "We'll do this however you want," he said. "We can have a long engagement if you need more time. We can keep it quiet if you're worried about what people will say about you remarrying so soon. Whatever you need to feel comfortable with this decision." Grace thought about it for a moment. "I don't want a long engagement," she said. "If we're going to do this, let's do it. The gossips will talk no matter when we marry, and I'm tired of living in limbo, not quite a wife but not quite free either. But I do have one condition." "Name it," Owen said immediately. "I want to keep working at the mercantile until the wedding," Grace said. "I need to save my own money to have something of my own. And after we're married, I'd like to keep working if Mr. Peterson will let me. I need to feel like I'm contributing, not just being provided for." Owen smiled, the first full smile Grace had seen from him. "I think that's more than fair. I wouldn't want you to give up your independence just because you're marrying me. In fact, I admire that you want to keep working. Shows character." They talked for another hour, making practical plans. They agreed to marry in 2 weeks, which would give Owen time to file the necessary paperwork, and Grace time to prepare herself mentally. They decided to have a simple ceremony at the courthouse with just a couple of witnesses. Nothing elaborate that might seem disrespectful to Thomas's memory. They discussed how they would share the household duties, how they would handle finances, all the mundane details that seemed desperately important when you were building a life with someone. As Grace walked back to the mercantile, she felt something she hadn't felt in weeks, not happiness exactly, but a sense of possibility. The future that had seemed so bleak and uncertain just yesterday now had a shape, a direction. She was still scared, still grieving, still not entirely sure she was making the right decision, but at least she was moving forward instead of just treading water. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur. Grace continued working at the mercantile, and Owen continued working at the mine, but they saw each other every evening. Owen would stop by the boarding house after he'd cleaned up from work, and they would walk together through Rhyolite, talking about everything and nothing. Grace learned that Owen was 28 years old, that he'd grown up on a ranch in Wyoming, that he'd come to Nevada after his brother died because he couldn't bear to stay in the places that reminded him of what he'd lost. "I understand that more than you know," Grace had told him when he shared that last part. Owen learned that Grace had grown up in Carson City, that she'd met Thomas at a church social when she was 19, that they'd married after a year of courtship and moved to Rhyolite chasing the promise of opportunity. He learned that she loved reading but rarely had time for it anymore, that she had a talent for sewing, and had once dreamed of opening her own dress shop, that she missed her sister desperately, but was too proud to show up at her door as a charity case. "You wouldn't be a charity case," Owen had said. "You'd be family." "That's just a kinder word for the same thing," Grace had replied, and Owen had nodded in understanding. The more time they spent together, the more Grace felt the tight knot of grief in her chest begin to loosen, just a fraction. She still cried at night sometimes, still felt the sharp stab of loss when she saw something that reminded her of Thomas. But she also found herself laughing at Owen's dry humor, looking forward to their evening walks, feeling grateful for his steady presence. She also began to notice things about Owen that intrigued her. The way he always offered his arm when they walked, even though his limp made it difficult. The way he listened when she talked, really listened, as if every word mattered. The way he spoke respectfully about everyone, even people other miners looked down on. The way he'd quietly slipped money to a young boy selling newspapers on the corner, telling the kid to keep the change from $1 even though the newspaper only cost a nickel. Grace realized that Owen Dalton was fundamentally a good man, the kind of man who would keep his promises and stand by his commitments even when it was hard. It wasn't the passionate, all-consuming love she'd had with Thomas, but maybe that wasn't what she needed right now. Maybe what she needed was exactly what Owen had offered: steadiness, partnership, someone to share the burden of living. The day before their wedding, Grace took off her morning dress for the first time in over a month. She had saved enough money from her wages to buy fabric from the mercantile, and she'd spent her evenings sewing a new dress in a soft gray color. It wasn't quite morning clothes, but it wasn't celebratory either, which felt appropriate for the complicated tangle of emotions she was carrying. That evening, Owen came by the boarding house with a small package wrapped in brown paper. "I know we said we weren't doing gifts," he said, "but I saw this and thought of you." Grace unwrapped the package to find a book, a beautiful hardcover edition of poetry by Emily Dickinson. She ran her fingers over the cover, touched beyond words. "Owen, this is too much. Books are expensive." "You said you loved reading," Owen replied simply. "Figured you should have something to read that's yours, that no one can take away from you." Grace felt tears pricking at her eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of gratitude, of being seen and understood by someone who barely knew her but was trying so hard to. "Thank you," she said softly. "This is the kindest gift I've received in a very long time." They stood there in the fading evening light, and Owen reached out slowly, giving Grace plenty of time to pull away if she wanted. When she didn't, he cupped her face gently in his calloused hand. "I'm going to do my best to make you happy, Grace. I know I can't replace what you lost, and I'm not going to try. But I promise I'll stand by you, take care of you, and honor the trust you're placing in me tomorrow." Grace covered his hand with hers, and for the first time since Thomas died, she felt a flicker of warmth in her chest that wasn't just grief and longing. "I know you will," she said, "and I promise I'll try to be the partner you deserve." Owen smiled and leaned forward, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. It was chaste and respectful, nothing that would compromise her reputation, but it made Grace's heart skip nonetheless. When he pulled back, she found herself wishing he'd stayed close a moment longer. The wedding took place at noon the next day at the courthouse. Grace wore her gray dress and carried a small bouquet of wildflowers that Owen had picked that morning. Owen wore his best clothes and had gotten a fresh haircut. The clerk who performed the ceremony looked bored, mechanically reciting the vows as if he'd done it 1,000 times before, which he probably had. But when Owen slipped Grace's original wedding ring back onto her finger, having resized it slightly to fit better, the moment felt sacred and significant despite the mundane setting. Grace looked into Owen's eyes as he said, "With this ring I thee wed," and she saw such earnest hope there that she felt her own resolve strengthen. This was the right choice. This was moving forward. This was choosing life over merely existing. When the clerk pronounced them husband and wife, Owen kissed Grace softly on the lips, a brief gentle touch that was over before she could fully process it. They signed the marriage certificate, thanked the clerk and their witnesses, 2 people who worked at the courthouse, and had agreed to stand in for a small fee, and walked out into the bright Nevada sunshine as Mr. and Mrs. Owen Dalton. Grace had arranged with Mr. Peterson to take the afternoon off, though he'd made it clear he expected her back the next morning. Owen had gotten the rest of the day off from the mine. They walked together to Owen's house, their house now, Grace supposed, and Owen held the door open for her to step inside as his wife. It felt strange and surreal. Just 5 weeks ago, Grace had been married to Thomas, living in a different house, planning a different future. Now she was married to a man she'd known for 2 weeks, standing in a house that was unfamiliar, facing a future that was completely unknown. Owen seemed to sense her nervousness. "I know this is a big adjustment," he said carefully. "I thought maybe we could just spend the afternoon getting you settled in. I cleared out space in the wardrobe for your things, and I can move some of my stuff around to make more room wherever you need it." Grace nodded, grateful that he wasn't expecting anything more from her immediately. They spent the next few hours in comfortable domesticity as Grace unpacked her meager belongings, and Owen helped her arrange them in the house. She hung her few dresses in the wardrobe next to his work clothes. She placed her hairbrush and the small hand mirror that had been her mother's on the dresser. She set her new book of poetry on the small table beside the bed. Grace tried not to think too hard about it, about the fact that she would be sharing a bed with Owen tonight, about the expectations that came with marriage. Owen hadn't pressured her about anything, but she knew what was generally expected of a wife, and the thought of being intimate with someone who wasn't Thomas made her stomach twist with anxiety. As if reading her mind, Owen spoke up as they were preparing a simple supper of bread and cold chicken. "Grace, I want you to know that I have no expectations tonight, or any night until you're ready. I know that physical intimacy is part of marriage, but I also know you're still grieving, still adjusting. We can take things as slow as you need." Grace felt a wave of relief so intense it almost made her dizzy. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I don't know how long I'll need." "However long it takes," Owen said firmly. "I'm a patient man, and I meant what I said about partnership. That means respecting your boundaries and your needs, even when it's difficult for me." That night, they lay in bed together with a careful distance between them, both staring at the ceiling in the darkness. Grace was acutely aware of Owen's presence beside her, of the warmth radiating from his body, of the sound of his breathing. It was so different from Thomas, who had always curled around her in sleep, who had run hot and kicked the covers off even in winter. "Grace." Owen's voice came softly through the darkness. "Yes. Are you doing all right with all of this?" Grace considered the question honestly. "I don't know," she admitted. "It's strange and scary and sad, but it also feels right somehow. Does that make sense?" "Perfect sense," Owen replied. "That's exactly how I feel." They were silent for a moment, and then Owen spoke again. "Can I hold your hand? Just your hand, nothing more." Grace reached out in the darkness until her fingers found his, and they lay there holding hands like children seeking comfort in the dark. It was such a simple thing, but Grace found it incredibly soothing. She wasn't alone. Whatever happened tomorrow or the next day or the day after that, she wasn't facing it alone anymore. She fell asleep that way, her hand in Owen's, and for the first time since Thomas died, she didn't wake up crying in the middle of the night. The next morning, Grace woke to find Owen already up and dressed for work. He'd made coffee and left a cup for her on the table, along with a note written in careful handwriting. "Didn't want to wake you. There is bread and jam for breakfast. See you this evening." Grace drank her coffee and ate her breakfast, then dressed and walked to the mercantile. Several people looked at her curiously as she passed, and she knew word of her marriage had already spread through Rhyolite. In a town this size, everyone knew everyone else's business almost before it happened. Mr. Peterson was waiting for her when she arrived, his expression sour as usual. "Heard you got married yesterday, Mrs. Dalton." Grace straightened her spine. "Yes, sir, I did." "Seems mighty quick after your first husband died," Mr. Peterson said, his tone making it clear what he thought of that. "Yes, sir, it was quick," Grace agreed, refusing to be ashamed. "But it was also necessary and right. I hope my marriage won't affect my work here." Mr. Peterson grunted. "Long as you show up and do your job, I don't care what you do on your own time. but I'll be watching to make sure being a new wife doesn't make you unreliable." It was a petty threat, but Grace ignored it and set about her work. The day passed slowly, with several customers making comments about her marriage, some congratulatory, some cattily judgmental. Grace kept her head high and answered politely when necessary, but she didn't offer explanations or justifications. Her life was her own, and she didn't owe anyone an accounting of her choices. Owen met her outside the mercantile when she finished work, and they walked home together. It was such a small thing, having someone to walk with, to talk to about the mundane details of the day, but Grace found she treasured it. Owen told her about a promising new vein they'd found in the mine, about a coworker who'd been injured but was expected to recover. Grace told him about the customers she'd helped, about Mr. Peterson's thinly veiled disapproval. "You want me to talk to him?" Owen asked, a protective edge in his voice. "No," Grace said firmly. "I can handle Mr. Peterson, but thank you for offering." They settled into a routine over the following weeks. Owen worked at the mine and Grace worked at the mercantile, and in the evenings they cooked dinner together, did chores together, talked together. They continued to sleep in the same bed with careful space between them, though Grace noticed the distance was gradually decreasing as she became more comfortable with Owen's presence. She was surprised to find that she enjoyed being married to Owen. He was easy to live with, considerate and thoughtful in ways that made daily life pleasant. He never complained about her cooking even when she burned things, which she did more often than she cared to admit. He helped with the washing and mending without being asked. He brought her little gifts, a pretty rock he'd found, a newspaper when he went into town, wildflowers he picked on his way home from work. Grace found herself reciprocating in small ways. She made his favorite meals when she could afford the ingredients. She mended his work clothes with extra care, reinforcing the seams so they would last longer. She started cutting his hair to save him the cost of the barber. She listened to his stories about work and his childhood with genuine interest, learning the details of his life piece by piece. One evening about 6 weeks into their marriage, Grace was sitting in the armchair by the fireplace, reading her book of poetry by lamplight. Owen was at the table, writing a letter to an old friend from Wyoming. The scene was so perfectly domestic, so peacefully content, that Grace felt a sudden rush of emotion that caught her completely off guard. She looked over at Owen, at the way the lamplight caught in his hair, at the concentration on his face as he wrote, at the way he absently chewed on the end of his pencil when he was thinking. And she realized with a start that she cared about him. Not in the desperate, passionate way she'd loved Thomas, but in a quieter, steadier way that had been growing without her quite noticing. She cared about his happiness. She looked forward to seeing him at the end of each day. She felt safe and valued and appreciated in his presence. She liked making him smile, liked the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he laughed at something she said. She admired his work ethic and his kindness and his patience with her grief. It wasn't the same as what she'd had with Thomas, but it was real and it was growing, and Grace realized she wanted it to keep growing. She wanted to let Owen fully into her life and her heart. She wanted to build something genuine with him, not just a marriage of convenience but a real partnership built on mutual respect and growing affection. That night, when they went to bed, Grace didn't maintain the careful distance she'd been keeping. Instead, she shifted closer to Owen, resting her head on his shoulder. She felt him tense in surprise for a moment, then relax, his arm coming around to hold her gently. "Is this all right?" Grace asked softly. "More than all right," Owen replied, and she could hear the smile in his voice. They fell asleep that way, and when Grace woke in the middle of the night, she found she'd curled into Owen in her sleep, her hand resting over his heart. Instead of pulling away, she stayed there, listening to the steady beat beneath her palm, and felt something inside her begin to heal. The next morning, Grace woke before Owen for the first time. She lay quietly, watching him sleep, studying the lines of his face in the early morning light. He looked younger when he slept, more vulnerable, and Grace felt a surge of protectiveness toward him that surprised her with its intensity. When Owen's eyes opened and found her watching him, she didn't look away. "Good morning," she said softly. "Good morning," Owen replied, his voice rough with sleep. "Is everything all right?" Instead of answering with words, Grace leaned forward and kissed him. A real kiss this time, not the chaste pecks they'd exchanged at their wedding and in the weeks since. Owen responded immediately, his hand coming up to cup the back of her head, deepening the kiss. When they finally broke apart, both breathing harder, Owen looked at Grace with a question in his eyes. "I'm ready," Grace said simply. "I can't promise I won't cry or that it won't be complicated, but I'm ready to really be your wife, Owen." Owen pulled her close, holding her tightly. "We'll go slow," he promised. "And if you need to stop at any point, we'll stop. No questions, no pressure." What followed was tender and careful, with Owen continually checking to make sure Grace was comfortable, that she wanted to continue. And Grace found that while it was different from being with Thomas, different in 1,000 small ways, it was also good and right and healing. When it was over, she did cry, but Owen held her and understood, and that understanding made all the difference. They were late to work that morning, but neither of them cared. As summer turned to fall and then to winter, Grace and Owen's marriage deepened and strengthened. They became not just husband and wife, but genuine partners, best friends who happened to share a bed and a life. Grace found that she could talk to Owen about anything, including her memories of Thomas. Instead of being jealous or threatened, Owen listened and honored those memories, understanding that Grace's capacity to love wasn't limited, that making room for him in her heart didn't mean pushing Thomas out. In December, 3 months after their wedding, Grace discovered she was pregnant. The realization came with a complicated mix of emotions. Part of her was thrilled at the prospect of becoming a mother. Part of her was terrified of all the things that could go wrong in childbirth, especially in a rough mining town with limited medical care. And part of her felt guilty, as if having a child with Owen was somehow betraying Thomas. She sat at the table one evening trying to find the words to tell Owen when he reached across and took her hand. "I know," he said gently. "I've been watching you and I know." "How do you feel about it?" Grace asked, searching his face. "Scared," Owen admitted. "Excited, grateful. Protective of both you and the baby. About 100 different things at once. How do you feel?" Grace felt tears spill down her cheeks, and Owen immediately moved to kneel beside her chair, wrapping his arms around her. "Talk to me, Grace. Whatever you're feeling, just talk to me." "I feel guilty," Grace whispered. "Thomas and I wanted children so badly, and we were going to start trying right before he got sick. And now I'm having a baby with you, and it feels like I'm replacing him, replacing the family we were supposed to have." Owen held her tighter. "You're not replacing anything or anyone. You're building something new, and that doesn't diminish what you had with Thomas. He would want you to have a full life, wouldn't he? He would want you to have children and joy and all the things you both dreamed of, even if it's with someone else." "I know that logically," Grace said, "but my heart is having trouble catching up." "Then we'll give your heart time," Owen said simply. "We've got 7 months or so before this baby comes. That's a lot of time to work through complicated feelings, and I'll be right here beside you the whole way." Grace pulled back enough to look into Owen's eyes. "Are you happy about the baby?" "Truly, truly," Owen confirmed. "I'm terrified something will go wrong, but yes, I'm happy. The thought of having a child with you, of building a family together, makes me happier than I knew I could be." Grace kissed him then, pouring all her complicated emotions into it, the guilt and the joy and the fear and the love that had been growing steadily in her heart. When they broke apart, Owen rested his forehead against hers. "We're going to be all right," he said. "All three of us. I promise." The pregnancy was difficult. Grace continued working at the mercantile through her first trimester, but morning sickness made it increasingly challenging. She finally had to quit in her 4th month when Mr. Peterson complained that her running outside to be sick was disturbing the customers. Grace had half expected Owen to be upset about losing her income, but instead he'd seemed relieved. "I've been worried about you working so hard while carrying the baby," he admitted. "I make enough at the mine to support us. It's tight, but we'll manage. I'd rather you rest and stay healthy." Grace used her time at home to prepare for the baby's arrival. She sewed tiny clothes from scraps of fabric she'd saved. She set up a corner of their bedroom as a nursery space, using an old wooden crate that Owen sanded smooth and lined with quilts as a cradle. She knitted booties and caps, her hands moving in the rhythms her mother had taught her years ago. She also wrote letters to her sister, sharing the news of her remarriage and pregnancy. Her sister's response was swift and warm, expressing happiness for Grace and relief that she'd found someone to care for her. She invited Grace and Owen to visit Carson City when the baby was old enough to travel, and Grace found herself looking forward to reuniting with her family, to showing them the life she'd built from the ashes of tragedy. As Grace's belly grew, so did Owen's protectiveness. He fussed over her constantly, making sure she was eating enough, insisting she rest more than she thought necessary, watching her with concerned eyes whenever she showed the slightest discomfort. It was sometimes annoying, but it was also touching. Grace had never felt so thoroughly cared for, so precious to someone. One evening in late February, when Grace was 7 months along and feeling huge and uncomfortable, they were lying in bed together, Owen's hand resting on her swollen belly. The baby kicked, and Owen's face lit up with wonder. "Did you feel that?" Grace laughed. "I feel every single kick, every single hour of every single day. This child takes after you with all the energy." Owen grinned and leaned down to speak to Grace's belly. "Hey there, little one. This is your papa. I want you to know that you're already so loved. Your mama and I can't wait to meet you." Grace felt tears prick her eyes as they did so easily these days. "You're going to be such a good father," she said softly. Owen looked up at her, his expression serious. "I hope so. I want to be. I want to give this child everything my father gave me: security, guidance, unconditional love. And I want to give you the support you need to be the mother I know you'll be." Grace pulled him up to kiss him, and as they lay there together in the lamplight, Grace realized something profound. She loved Owen Dalton. Somewhere between his unexpected proposal and this moment, between grief and healing, between partnership and intimacy, she had fallen completely and genuinely in love with her husband. It was different from the love she'd felt for Thomas, less desperate and consuming, more steady and mature. But it was no less real, no less valuable. She loved Owen's kindness and patience. She loved his dry humor and his quiet strength. She loved the way he looked at her as if she was the most important person in his world. She loved the life they'd built together, the partnership they'd forged, the family they were creating. "Owen," she said, her voice shaking slightly, "I need to tell you something." He looked at her with concern. "What is it? Are you feeling all right? Is it the baby?" "No, nothing like that," Grace assured him. She took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "I love you. I'm in love with you. I didn't think I would be, didn't think I could be after losing Thomas. But I am. I love you, Owen Dalton, and I need you to know that." Owen's eyes widened, and Grace saw him blink rapidly as if fighting back tears. "Grace," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I've loved you since the day I saw you standing behind that counter in the mercantile, looking so lost and alone and still so strong. I bought that ring planning to propose before I even knew if you'd say yes. I've loved you every day since, and I'll love you every day for the rest of my life." They held each other close, and Grace felt the last piece of guilt and grief that she'd been carrying finally release its hold on her heart. She would always love Thomas's memory, always treasure what they'd had. But Owen was her present and her future, and she was ready to embrace that fully, without reservation or regret. Their son was born on a warm day in April 1907. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Grace was terrified that something would go wrong, that she would lose the baby or die herself and leave Owen alone. But Owen stayed by her side through all of it, holding her hand, wiping her forehead, telling her she was strong and brave and that she could do this. When the baby finally arrived, red-faced and squalling, the midwife placed him on Grace's chest, and Grace felt her heart expand in ways she hadn't known were possible. "Look at him, Owen," she whispered. "Look at our son." Owen was crying openly, tears streaming down his face as he looked at his wife and newborn child. "He's perfect," he said. "You're both perfect." They named him Thomas Owen, honoring both the past and the present. Little Tommy had his father's blue-green eyes and a surprising amount of dark hair, and he was healthy and loud and absolutely beautiful. Owen was besotted from the first moment, and Grace fell even more in love with her husband watching him cradle their tiny son with such care and wonder. The first few months of parenthood were exhausting and overwhelming. Tommy was a colicky baby who cried more than he slept, and Grace and Owen took turns walking him around the small house at all hours of the night. Grace's body ached from the trauma of birth, and she was constantly tired. But she was also happier than she'd been in longer than she could remember. Owen proved to be exactly the father he'd promised to be. He changed diapers without complaint, got up for middle-of-the-night feedings, sang to Tommy in a surprisingly good voice, and looked at both Grace and the baby with such love that it made Grace's heart ache in the best way. He cut back his hours at the mine, taking a slight pay reduction so he could spend more time at home helping with Tommy. "The mine will always be there," he said when Grace protested that they needed the money. "But Tommy will only be this small once, and I'm not missing it." When Tommy was 3 months old, Grace and Owen took him to Carson City to visit Grace's sister. The stagecoach ride was long and uncomfortable, with Tommy fussing for most of the journey, but it was worth it to see Grace's sister Emily and her family again. Emily cried when she met Owen and Tommy, hugging Grace so tightly she could barely breathe. "I'm so happy for you," Emily said. "When I heard about Thomas, I was so worried, but look at you now. You've built such a beautiful life." Grace looked at Owen, who was showing Tommy to Emily's children, his face patient and kind even though her nephew was being a bit rough in his curiosity. "I have," Grace agreed. "It's not the life I expected, but it's good. Really good." They stayed in Carson City for a week, and Grace loved watching Owen with her extended family. He fit in naturally, helping Emily's husband with repairs around their house, playing with the children, charming Grace's aunt and uncle who came to visit. When it was time to return to Rhyolite, Emily pulled Grace aside. "That man loves you something fierce," she said. "And you love him the same way. I can see it in how you look at each other. Thomas would be happy for you, Grace. He'd be glad you found someone who treats you so well." Grace hugged her sister, feeling grateful for the blessing and the permission, even though she'd reached a place where she no longer needed it. She knew that Thomas would want her to be happy, just as she would have wanted the same for him if their positions had been reversed. Back in Rhyolite, life continued its steady rhythm. Tommy grew from a tiny infant into a chubby, happy baby who smiled at everyone and everything. Grace took him on walks through town, pointing out the interesting things they passed, singing to him, talking to him as if he could understand every word. She loved being a mother, loved the way Tommy's face lit up when he saw her, the way he snuggled into her when he was tired, the way his tiny hand would grip her finger with surprising strength. Owen was promoted at the mine to a supervisory position, which came with better pay and less dangerous work. The extra money meant they could start saving, could think about maybe expanding their house or even buying a larger one. But Grace was content with their little white house with the vegetable garden. It was where she'd married Owen, where they'd conceived and brought home their son. It was full of good memories and the promise of more to come. On their first anniversary, Owen surprised Grace with a proper wedding ring for himself. "I know we couldn't afford it when we got married," he said, slipping the simple gold band onto his finger. "But I wanted you to know that I'm just as committed to this marriage as you are. This ring is my promise that I'll stand by you, love you, and be faithful to you for the rest of my life." Grace threw her arms around him, laughing and crying at the same time. "I never doubted it for a second," she said, "but I love that you wanted to wear a ring. I love everything about you, Owen Dalton." They renewed their vows that night in the privacy of their home, just the two of them and baby Tommy sleeping in his cradle. They spoke from their hearts, promising each other forever, and sealed it with a kiss that held all the love and commitment and partnership they'd built over the past year. 2 years later, Grace gave birth to a daughter they named Lily Grace. The labor was easier this time, and Lily was a calm, content baby who seemed to love everyone and everything. Tommy, now a rambunctious toddler, was fascinated by his baby sister, constantly wanting to touch her and help take care of her. With 2 children, the house felt genuinely too small, so Owen used their savings to add on 2 small bedrooms. He did most of the work himself with help from some friends at the mine, and Grace loved watching the house grow to accommodate their expanding family. Life in Rhyolite continued to be good. The mine was productive and the town was thriving. Grace's days were filled with the busy work of caring for 2 young children, and while it was exhausting, it was also deeply fulfilling. She loved her little family, loved the life she and Owen had created together. Sometimes, usually late at night when the children were asleep and she and Owen were lying in bed together, Grace would think about Thomas. The sharp pain of his loss had faded over the years, replaced by a bittersweet fondness. She would think about what might have been if he'd lived, but she couldn't regret the path her life had taken. She couldn't regret Owen or Tommy or Lily or any of the beautiful things that had come from tragedy. "What are you thinking about?" Owen would ask on those nights, always attuned to her moods. "Just how life works out sometimes," Grace would reply. "How the worst thing that ever happened to me led to some of the best things in my life." Owen would pull her closer, and they would lie there in the darkness, grateful for each other, for their children, for the improbable and beautiful life they'd built together. When Tommy was 5 and Lily was 3, Grace discovered she was pregnant again. This pregnancy was unexpected but welcomed, and in the spring of 1912, they welcomed another son, whom they named Daniel. Danny was a sweet, easy baby who seemed to come into the world already content with his place in it. With 3 children, life was chaotic and noisy and full of laughter and occasional tears. The house felt small again, but Owen and Grace decided they liked the cozy closeness, the way they were always near each other, the way the children's laughter echoed through every room. Owen thrived in his role as father and husband. He taught Tommy to ride a horse and how to care for the vegetable garden. He braided Lily's hair in the mornings before work, his big calloused hands surprisingly gentle with the ribbon and pins. He rocked Danny to sleep every night, singing the same lullabies he'd sung to the older children. Grace watched her husband with their children and felt her heart overflow with love. This life, this family, this partnership, it was more than she'd ever dreamed possible when she'd been standing behind that mercantile counter 5 years ago, trying to sell her wedding ring just to survive. One evening, when Grace was nursing Danny and watching Owen play a building game with Tommy and Lily on the floor, she was struck by how perfectly everything had worked out. Not perfectly in the sense that nothing bad had ever happened. She'd lost Thomas. Owen had lost his brother. Life had been hard and uncertain and sometimes painful. But perfect in the sense that all the broken pieces had somehow formed something beautiful and whole. Later that night, after the children were in bed, Grace found her old wedding ring where she kept it in a small wooden box in the dresser. She hadn't worn it since marrying Owen, but she'd kept it all these years, unable to part with it completely. She traced the inscription inside her initials and Thomas's, the date of their wedding, and felt a wave of affection and gratitude for the young man she'd loved who had been taken too soon. "Thank you," she whispered to his memory. "Thank you for the time we had, and thank you for the ring that brought Owen into my life." She put the ring back in its box and turned to find Owen watching her from the doorway. "You all right?" he asked softly. "I'm wonderful," Grace said, and she meant it with her whole heart. She crossed the room to her husband and wrapped her arms around him. "I was just thinking about how lucky I am, how much I love you, how grateful I am for everything we've built together." Owen held her tight. "I'm the lucky one," he said. "That day you walked into my house and said yes to my crazy proposal, that was the luckiest day of my life." Grace laughed. "It was a pretty crazy proposal. Worked though, didn't it?" Owen said with a grin. "It worked," Grace agreed, rising up on her toes to kiss him. "It worked perfectly." They stood there in their small bedroom, holding each other, and Grace thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. From grief to healing, from strangers to partners, from partnership to deep and abiding love. It hadn't been an easy journey, but it had been worth every difficult step. In the years that followed, life continued to unfold with its mixture of joy and challenge. Tommy grew into a thoughtful boy who loved books like his mother and had his father's steady temperament. Lily was spirited and affectionate, charming everyone she met with her bright smile and endless questions. Danny was quiet and observant, content to watch the world around him with serious eyes that seemed to take in everything. The mine eventually played out, as mines in boom towns often did, and Rhyolite began to shrink as people left in search of other opportunities. But Owen had been wise with their money, saving steadily over the years, and they had enough to weather the changes. He found work as a foreman at a ranch outside of town, using the skills he'd learned growing up in Wyoming, and the family moved to a larger house on the ranch property. The children thrived in the ranch setting, with space to run and play and explore. Grace started her vegetable garden again, this time much larger, and found she loved the rhythm of ranch life. She and Owen worked side by side, raising their children, tending the land, building a life that was rich in love if not always in material wealth. On their 10th anniversary, Owen and Grace took a rare evening to themselves, leaving the children with a neighbor. They rode out to a hill overlooking the valley, bringing a picnic dinner and a blanket to watch the sunset. As they sat together, Grace leaned against Owen's shoulder and thought about the decade they'd spent together. 10 years, she said. "When you proposed in the mercantile, did you imagine we'd make it this far?" "I hoped," Owen said, but I couldn't have imagined how good it would be. You've given me more than I ever dreamed of having, Grace. A family, a home, a love that makes every day worthwhile. You're my everything." Grace turned to look at her husband, at the lines that time and sun had etched into his face, at the silver starting to thread through his hair, at the love and contentment in his eyes. "You saved my life," she said. "I was drowning in grief and hopelessness, and you threw me a lifeline. You gave me a reason to keep going, and then you gave me reasons to want to go forward instead of just backward. I love you more than I can possibly express." Owen cupped her face in his hands and kissed her deeply, pouring 10 years of love and devotion into it. When they finally broke apart, the sun was painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, and Grace thought it was the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen. "Here's to 10 more years," Owen said, raising an imaginary glass. "And 10 more after that, and 10 more after that, until we're old and gray and still kissing under the stars." "Here's to forever," Grace replied, kissing him again. They stayed on that hill until the stars came out, holding each other and talking about everything and nothing, grateful for the past, content with the present, and excited for the future. And as they rode back to the ranch house where their 3 children were waiting, Grace thought about the gold wedding ring that had brought them together, about the widow who'd been desperate enough to sell it and the cowboy who'd bought it to give it back. It had been the beginning of something neither of them could have predicted, something that had grown from necessity and kindness into genuine love and partnership. Grace had never expected to love again after Thomas, had never expected to find happiness in the aftermath of tragedy. But life had surprised her, as it so often does, and she'd found a love that was different but no less precious, a family that filled her days with purpose and joy, and a partner who made every burden lighter and every happiness sweeter. Years continued to pass in their gentle rhythm. The children grew and changed, developing their own personalities and dreams. Tommy became interested in law after reading books Grace borrowed from the small library in the nearest town. Lily developed a talent for music and could often be found singing while she did her chores. Danny discovered he had a way with horses and spent hours working with the ranch's animals. Grace and Owen aged together, their love deepening and maturing with each passing year. They faced challenges: a severe drought one year that tested their resources, illness that swept through the family but thankfully left no lasting damage, the normal struggles of raising children and making ends meet. But they faced everything together as partners, and that made all the difference. When Tommy turned 18 and announced he wanted to go to law school in San Francisco, Grace felt the bittersweet pang of watching her child grow up and prepare to leave. Owen, always practical, helped their son figure out the finances and logistics. They were proud of Tommy's ambition and intelligence, even as they knew they would miss him terribly. Lily was 15 when a young man from the neighboring ranch started courting her with Owen and Grace's permission. Grace watched her daughter navigate young love and remembered her own youth, her courtship with Thomas, and felt the strange circle of life continuing. She gave Lily advice when asked, shared her own experiences, and trusted that the values she and Owen had instilled would guide their daughter well. Danny, at 13, was already showing signs of being a gifted horseman. The ranch owner had noticed and offered to train him properly, maybe even help him get work at larger ranches when he was older. Danny was thrilled, and Owen and Grace were proud of their youngest son's talent and dedication. On a warm evening in June 1920, Grace and Owen sat on the porch of their ranch house, watching the sun set over the valley. They were both in their 40s now, their children nearly grown, their hair touched with gray. Grace leaned her head on Owen's shoulder, comfortable and content in the familiar warmth of his presence. "You ever think about that day in the mercantile?" she asked. "When you asked me to hold the ring?" Owen chuckled. "I think about it all the time. I think about how nervous I was, how sure I was that you'd think I was insane when I proposed. I think about the look on your face when I told you I was buying it to give back to you." "I thought you'd lost your mind," Grace admitted with a laugh. "A stranger proposing to a widow he barely knew. It was the craziest thing anyone had ever suggested to me." "And yet you said yes," Owen said, squeezing her hand. "And yet I said yes," Grace agreed. "Best decision I ever made, saying yes to you." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, and then Grace spoke again. "Thomas would have liked you, I think. You're both good men, just in different ways. I'm lucky to have loved two good men in my life." Owen kissed the top of her head. "I hope I've made you as happy as he did. I know I can never replace him, but I hope I've been a good husband to you." Grace sat up and turned to face Owen directly. "You've been an extraordinary husband. You've given me a life full of love and partnership and purpose. You've given me 3 beautiful children. You've stood by me through everything, good and bad. You've honored my past while building a future with me. I couldn't have asked for a better partner in this life." Owen Dalton. Owen's eyes were suspiciously bright as he pulled Grace into a tight embrace. "I love you, Grace. I'll love you until my last breath and beyond if such things are possible." "I love you too," Grace whispered. "Always and forever." As the sun dipped below the horizon and the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Grace thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. From the girl who'd married Thomas full of youthful optimism, to the widow selling her wedding ring just to survive, to the woman who'd taken a chance on an impossible proposal from a kind cowboy, to the wife and mother and partner she'd become over the years. It had been a journey of loss and healing, of grief and love, of endings and new beginnings. It had been difficult and beautiful and worth every moment. And as she sat there on the porch with Owen's arms around her, Grace felt profoundly grateful for all of it, the joy and the sorrow, the love and the loss, the past and the present, and the future that still stretched ahead of them. The years that followed were good ones. Tommy did go to law school and eventually established a practice in San Francisco, though he visited home regularly and wrote letters every week. Lily married her young man in a beautiful ceremony at the ranch, and Grace cried happy tears watching her daughter pledge her life to someone who loved her well. Danny grew into a skilled horseman and eventually became a ranch foreman himself, staying close to home and visiting his parents often. Grace and Owen became grandparents, delighting in Lily's children when she brought them to visit. They aged gracefully together, their love never diminishing despite the years. They still held hands when they walked. They still kissed goodnight every evening. They still looked at each other with affection and appreciation after decades of marriage. When Grace was in her 60s, she pulled out the old wooden box where she kept Thomas's ring. She looked at it for a long moment, remembering the young woman she'd been, the man she'd loved and lost. Then she carefully wrapped it in cloth and gave it to Tommy during one of his visits. "This was from my first marriage," she explained to her grown son. "I want you to have it, to remember that love comes in many forms and that loss, while painful, doesn't have to be the end of the story. Your father gave me this ring back when I needed it most, and it became the foundation of the life we built together." Tommy held the ring carefully, understanding the weight of what his mother was sharing. "Thank you, Mama. I'll treasure it, and I'll remember the story." Grace hugged her son, grateful that he understood, grateful for the family she and Owen had built, grateful for the life that had unfolded from one desperate moment and one unexpected act of kindness. Owen continued working at the ranch into his 60s. only finally retiring when his bad leg made the physical labor too difficult. By then, they had enough saved to live comfortably, and they spent their days in peaceful contentment, working in the garden, reading together, entertaining their grandchildren, and simply enjoying each other's company. On their 40th wedding anniversary, their children threw them a party at the ranch. Friends and neighbors came from all around to celebrate the couple who'd become something of a legend in the area, the widow who'd been selling her wedding ring, and the cowboy who'd bought it to propose, building a love story that had lasted decades. Speeches were given, toasts were made, and through it all, Grace and Owen sat side by side, holding hands and smiling at each other with the ease of two people who knew each other completely and loved each other deeply. When it was Grace's turn to speak, she stood up on shaky legs. Age was catching up with both of them and looked around at the gathered crowd. Her children and grandchildren, her friends, the community that had become her family. She looked at Owen, and her heart was so full she could barely find words. 40 years ago, she began, her voice still strong despite her age. I was standing in a mercantile in Rhyolite, trying to sell my wedding ring because I'd lost my husband and didn't know how I was going to survive. I was broken and grieving and couldn't see a way forward. She paused, gathering her thoughts. Then a cowboy came into the shop, a man I barely knew, and he did the craziest thing anyone has ever done for me. He bought that ring, and then he gave it back to me as a proposal of marriage. He offered me partnership and companionship and a way forward when I couldn't see one myself. Grace felt tears streaming down her face, but they were happy tears. Owen Dalton, you saved my life that day. You gave me hope when I had none. You gave me love when I thought I'd never love again. You gave me a family and a home and 40 years of happiness I never expected to have. You've been my rock, my partner, my best friend, and the love of my life. Thank you for seeing me when I was at my lowest and choosing to love me anyway. The crowd erupted in applause, and Owen stood to embrace his wife, both of them crying now. You're my everything, Grace, he said into her hair. You always have been, from the moment I saw you. Loving you has been the greatest privilege of my life. They held each other while their children and grandchildren and friends celebrated around them, and Grace thought about how miraculous life could be. How tragedy could lead to triumph, how endings could become beginnings, how love could be found in the most unexpected places. As the party continued into the evening, Grace and Owen slipped away to their favorite spot on the porch, watching the sunset as they had countless times over the decades. They sat close together, Grace's head on Owen's shoulder, his arm around her waist, comfortable and content in the twilight of their lives. No regrets? Owen asked softly. Not a single one, Grace replied. Well, except maybe that I didn't buy more fabric for Lily's wedding dress. It could have used more lace. Owen laughed, the sound warm and familiar. Always practical, my Grace. Someone has to be, Grace teased, then grew more serious. But truly, Owen, I have no regrets. This life we've built together, it's been more than I could have dreamed. You've made me happier than I knew I could be. You've done the same for me, Owen said. I was just drifting after my brother died, going through the motions. Then I saw you in that mercantile, and suddenly I had a purpose again. Loving you, building a life with you, raising our children together, it's given meaning to everything. They watched the sun sink below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant colors, and Grace felt at peace. She'd lived a full life, loved deeply twice, raised good children, and built something lasting with a man who'd taken a chance on a grieving widow. It was a good life, a beautiful life, and she was grateful for every moment of it. The years that remained to Grace and Owen were gentle ones. They spent their days in quiet contentment, surrounded by family and friends. They watched their grandchildren grow and begin their own families. They tended their garden and read books together and sat on the porch watching sunsets. And through it all, they loved each other with the deep, abiding love that comes from decades of partnership and shared experience. When Grace was 70, she fell ill with pneumonia. Owen sat by her bedside day and night, holding her hand, reading to her, telling her stories of their life together. As she drifted in and out of consciousness, she would sometimes wake to find him there, his aged face lined with worry and love, and she would squeeze his hand to let him know she was still fighting. But eventually, Grace knew the fight was ending. One evening, as the sun was setting and painting their bedroom in golden light, she gathered her strength and pulled Owen close. "I need you to know," she whispered, her voice weak but clear, "that you made my life beautiful. After I lost Thomas, I didn't think I'd ever be happy again, but you proved me wrong. You gave me 47 years of love and partnership and joy. Thank you for buying that ring. Thank you for proposing. Thank you for loving me." Owen was crying openly now, tears streaming down his weathered face. "Don't talk like you're saying goodbye. You're going to get better. You have to get better." Grace smiled gently. "We both know that's not true, my love, and it's all right. I've had a good life, a wonderful life. I've been blessed with 2 great loves, beautiful children, a family I adore. I'm ready, Owen. I'm at peace." She reached up with trembling fingers to touch his face. "But I need you to promise me something. Promise me you'll keep living, keep finding joy, keep spending time with our children and grandchildren. Don't give up on life just because I'm gone. Live enough for both of us." "I promise," Owen choked out, though they both knew it was a promise that would be hard to keep. Grace's eyes were starting to close, exhaustion pulling her under. "I love you, Owen Dalton. Thank you for 47 beautiful years." "I love you too, Grace," Owen said, holding her hand tightly. "I'll love you forever." Grace squeezed his hand one last time, smiled, and let go, slipping peacefully away as the sun set outside their window. Owen held her for a long time, crying quietly, mourning the loss of the woman who had been his everything for nearly 5 decades. The funeral was well attended, with people coming from all over to pay their respects to Grace Dalton, beloved wife, mother, grandmother, and friend. Her children eulogized her beautifully, sharing memories that made people laugh and cry. Tommy told the story of how his parents had met, of the widow selling her wedding ring and the cowboy who'd bought it to propose, and everyone agreed it was one of the greatest love stories they'd ever heard. Owen lived for another 5 years after Grace's death. He kept his promise to her, staying involved with his children and grandchildren, tending the garden she'd loved, keeping the house they'd shared. But everyone could see that part of him had died with Grace, that he was just waiting to join her again. When Owen passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 75, his children buried him next to Grace in the small cemetery outside of town. On the shared headstone they inscribed, "Owen and Grace Dalton, partners in life, reunited in death, a love that began with a ring and lasted forever." At the funeral, Tommy stood before the gathered mourners and told their story one last time. He spoke of tragedy and hope, of loss and new beginnings, of a desperate widow and a kind cowboy whose crazy proposal had led to 47 years of partnership and love. He spoke of the lesson their lives taught, that love could be found in unexpected places, that endings could become beginnings, and that taking a chance on someone could lead to the most beautiful of outcomes. As he spoke, Tommy clutched the small wooden box containing Thomas's wedding ring, the ring that had started it all. He thought about how that simple gold band had brought his parents together, had been the catalyst for the family he and his siblings had grown up in, had led to the love story that had inspired everyone who knew them. After the funeral, Tommy gave the ring to his own son, Grace and Owen's oldest grandson, along with the story of how it had brought his grandparents together. "Love is a gift," Tommy told his son, "and sometimes the greatest love stories begin in the most unexpected ways. Remember that, and remember them." The ring was passed down through generations, along with the story of the widow who'd been selling her wedding ring and the cowboy who'd bought it to propose. It became a family legend, a reminder that love could bloom even in the darkest times, that kindness could change lives, and that taking a chance on someone could lead to something beautiful and lasting. And somewhere, in whatever comes after this life, Grace and Owen were together again, holding hands and watching sunsets, their love continuing beyond death just as Owen had promised all those years ago. The widow and the cowboy, partners forever, proof that even in the harsh landscape of the Old West, love could not only survive but thrive, growing from the smallest seed of kindness into something magnificent and eternal. Their story lived on, inspiring generations to come, reminding people that sometimes the most broken moments lead to the most beautiful beginnings, and that love in all its forms is always worth reaching for, even when it seems impossible. Grace and Owen had proven that life could surprise you, that second chances were real, and that love, when built on partnership, respect, and genuine care, could last not just a lifetime but echo through eternity.